Hello, everyone. I'm Caitlin from MCTAC, and I'd like to welcome you to this morning's webinar on Home and Community-Based Services Level of Care Eligibility Determination Part 2. Before we get started, I'm going to run through just a few quick logistical things. We do plan to have time for Q&A, so please chat in your questions to the host throughout the presentation. If the chat is not available on the right-hand side of your screen, you can access it by hitting the little thought bubble on the bottom panel of your screen. And again, chat all your questions into the host. Additionally, we wanted to let everyone know that the slides are already available and they've been posted to our website and included in the chat. So you should see that in your chat, and the recording will be available a few days following the webinar. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our state partners who will begin the presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. This is Colette Pullen with the Department of Health, and I'm here with OPWDD, and they'll introduce themselves as they talk. And so I know this is a long-awaited webinar from our two other HCBS webinars, but I think this will be really helpful for folks to walk you through the process today and be able to coordinate eligibility for children who have a DD condition and want to be part of the children's waiver. And that is what we're specifically talking about today is the target populations of developmental disability in the medically fragile population and developmental disability in children who are in foster care. We had two previous webinars about HCBS eligibility, and if you want to know about the SED target population and the medically fragile population on its own merit, then those slides are available as well as information that has been posted. Today we're going to just focus on those two target populations and how are the health home care manager or CS going to coordinate with the OPWDD DDRO children's liaison. So OPWDD has designated staff to be children's liaisons, to be knowledgeable and wise about the children's waiver, to be able to help all of you move through their systems. So I think that's great. And we're going to just get started here. I just have a couple intro slides, and then our OPWDD partners are going to walk you through the steps. So the first thing is we know everybody uses different types of terminology, and we thought it would be really important since we just throw out the word level of care, and it means something different in the children's waiver versus OPWDD world. So we want to make sure people understand that because in our 1915C waiver, it just kind of says it all over the place in different formats. So the first is ICF-I LCED, because we like initials and acronyms. So this means Intermediate Care Facility for Individuals with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Level of Care Eligibility Determination Form. So you need to meet OPWDD's eligibility and their level of care to even go through the target population. And then there's steps for the risk factors and for the functional criteria. So it's important when throughout the slides, when that is mentioned, we're talking about the OPWDD process to make someone meet their level of care determination. And then we have the HCBS LOC, which is for the children's waiver, the home and community-based level of care. So OPWDD needs to determine their level of care to meet that target population and then go through the risk factors and the functional, and then you get an overall HCBS level of care for the children's waiver in the various target populations. And then there used to be the OPWDD care at home level of care, so that was the former waiver that got combined with the 6 waivers into our children's waiver. And so we just want to make sure that people understand that that was a different level of care, right, because that waiver has now been combined. So that's really important for folks to understand. So, you know, the care at home program is no more. So we are going to be focusing on these 2 the first two level of cares. And then the last thing is you'll see throughout the workflow the initial CL, and that stands for that OPWDD, DDRO, Children's Liaison, so we didn't have to write that out all the time, so you will know who your partner is. And then, next slide. We just want to remind everybody for the children's waiver, again, our LOC, the overall determination for the children's waiver and to get access to the waiver. And the purpose is, right, for those children that are very high risk to either go into a higher level of care, or we want them to return home from a higher level of care, and how can we provide services for those children to maintain them in their home, in their community safely. And this is the overall goal. So not every child you work with who's in Medicaid or in health home will need that level of care. And so you really need to start to learn the HCBS services and what they can do and what types of children they can assist in their needs and the needs that they may have. So you understand who are the children that may be eligible. And our OMH partners and OCFS and other folks did a great webinar in April about questions that you could ask yourself as you're working with an individual child, youth, and if you thought they might be eligible. So you should use that as a helpful tip for yourself. And then the next slide just reminds you all that for the children's waiver, there is 4 target populations, right? SED, Med-Frag, DD, Med-Frag, DD, foster care, and the last 2 are what we're talking about today. And again, as I mentioned, we've already had 2 webinars that have outlined the first 2 target populations. And then also to remind folks, because we have received a couple of questions, that now with this consolidated waiver, we are serving children all the way up to the age of 21. So there was previous waivers that only went to 18, but now as a consolidated waiver, we're serving the whole population birth to 21. And then I hope you've seen the next slide and you're already doing this, is we have really encouraged folks that the most expedient path or more timely path to the children's waiver level of care would be to go through the Med-Frag target population for those children that you believe have complex medical needs and also may have a DD condition or diagnosis. So we want you, care managers in CS, if you have a child that is presented to you or was from the former Care at Home OPWDD waiver, that you go through the Med-Frag door. And when OPWDD goes through these processes, you'll see why they do have a process, and it does take a bit of time and materials. So we believe that going through the target population of medically frail would be more expedient for the family. Obviously, the family has choice, so you're going to be doing what they would like to do. And then this just outlines that if a child is not eligible for the children's waiver, but they have a DD condition or diagnosis, then you really want to get to know OPWDD and the ability to get them into the comprehensive waiver. And they will also mention this in the flows. They worked out a great process to make it easy for the care manager and CS. And if the child is found eligible for the children's waiver, then we want to make sure that even though the child gets served in the children's waiver, that you talk with the family about the comprehensive waiver and its benefits. Because especially if a child ages out, we want them to have a direct line to OPWDD and not for you and the family to jump through some extra hoops. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but our goal here is that you understand the 4 target populations and how you may be able to maneuver around. And I think the next slide talks about the best practice of that. So again, to just tell you what the benefits are of OPWDD and the choice that a family may have. I think Lisa Kennedy is going to start talking about that.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lisa Kennedy. I'm with OPWDD. And this slide talks about the best practice for former care-at-home children and new enrollees with a DD diagnosis or condition. And basically, it is best practice to establish and maintain a child's ICF-I eligibility. It's not a mandated requirement, but we strongly encourage care managers to work to maintain ICF-I eligibility for those children that have transitioned from the care-at-home waiver and also those new enrollees with a DD diagnosis or condition. There are several reasons why it should be maintained or established. If the child and family decides to transfer to the OPWDD comprehensive waiver at any point, the documentation needed for that transfer is up to date. So it means maintained yearly to stay active. If the child is aging out of the children's waiver, so they're 20 and they're approaching their 21st birthday, the documentation is up to date to appropriately transition to the OPWDD comprehensive waiver. Also, this allows the child to access OPWDD Article 16 clinic services, such as OT, PT. And if the ICF-I LCED lapses, so it's not performed on an annual basis, then the child needs to start the process all over again from the beginning. And I did want to mention what's not included on this slide is sometimes younger children actually improve medically, so their medical frailty improves and they possibly would not be eligible for the children's waiver. If the ICF-I LCED is maintained, they could easily transfer to the comprehensive waiver without having a lapse in services, which could be several months. Okay, so the next few slides, they're going to be very detailed, and I believe in the chat function, MCTAC sent out the DDRO manual, the eligibility process for the children's waiver. So please have that handy if you can. I believe it was also sent out via email. So we're going to reference on each title page where we are basically in the manual so you can follow along. And we are going to be going over first.
Sure. So this is Kate Marley from OPWDD. I just wanted to jump in and explain the two training materials. Obviously, participants are going to have a copy of the slides, which Elisa will be going through in terms of each of the process flows that we're working on. You will also have the draft manual on eligibility processes. What we're suggesting is that folks use this for the next 30 days and then make notes in it as you go. What we want to do is have this be a really tight, useful resource for both our district staff, our DDRO children's liaisons, and anyone else who is assisting children and families who are enrolled in the children's waiver. So use it, make notes on it, and then we're going to give you a contact to email if you have recommended changes or suggestions, and then ideally in the next month or so, we will be issuing this as a final. What you have available to you is a draft. Sorry to interrupt.
Nope, not at all. Okay, so first we're going to be talking about redeterminations of level of care eligibility determinations. The first slide, this shows the medically fragile children who already have an established ICF-I level of care eligibility. So this includes children that have transitioned from the OPWDD care-at-home waiver. In the manual, if you go to page 2, it shows the very first table, medically fragile redeterminations. On the slide, we kind of pulled out the high-level steps and parties involved, but the manual itself really drills down into the detail that is needed for when you need to complete a certain step and move forward in the process. So the first step, as you can see in blue, the Health Home Care Manager, or CS, completes the medically fragile level of care in the UAS and follows the medically fragile process outcomes. If OPWDD, ICF-I LCED is desired, and we just talked about this, the best practice is to maintain this, but again, it is the family's choice, and if they so desire to keep it up to date, the health home care manager and CES collects required documentation. And what documentation is that? It's spelled out in the table, step 2, and it's also in the slides later on. I believe it is slides 19 and 20. So I'll just go over this briefly. The required documentation that the health home care manager and CES must collect is the current general medical report, a copy of the child's plan of care, an updated psychological report if there is a significant change in the child's functioning, and a statement from the care manager. This is actually part of this attestation field within the Children's Waiver Transmittal Form. That is another section in the DDRO manual. And as long as that statement is, the radial button is checked, it confirms that the documentation required for the LCED redetermination remains valid and reflects the current needs of the child. So along with the required transmittal form and the documentation, the health home care manager will send all of this in a secure email in one file to the DDRO Children's Liaison via the HCS secure email box. Now, if you're wondering what is that, that's also in the manual and in the PowerPoint. It is on slide 21. So there are 5 regional HCS or Children's Liaison mailboxes, and the documentation should be sent accordingly depending on what county the child lives. Okay, now going on to the third box, which I just mentioned. So that's also described on page 11. So those are the first 3 steps that the care manager completes. Moving on. Now the OPWDD Children's Liaison has this documentation. They review what is there and advises the health home care manager or CS if additional information is needed to process the redetermination. If the child is found ICF-I eligible, the Children's Liaison signs the LCED and emails the documentation to the health home care manager and CES. So they email the LCED to the care manager. During this process, the health home care manager and CES will continue to work with the family on their plan of care. So work doesn't end, or it's not just held up just because this process is going forward. The work needs to continue on the child's plan of care.
Yeah, I think it's really important to note that once you have the care manager or CS has determined the children's waiver, medically frail, level of care, whether they're continue to be eligible or not, then you would do the process that is outlined in our workflow. So this is how you connect with OPWDD.
Okay, thanks, Colette. And then the last box, if the child no longer meets ICF-I LCED eligibility, the Children's Liaison sends a letter to the health home care manager with a copy to the child and family. Now, the next, this is what I had mentioned. These are the documentation requirements for annual redeterminations of level of care eligibility. As I mentioned, the current general medical report, a copy of the child's plan of care, updated psychological report, and as I mentioned, from the statement from the care manager that the documentation required remains valid and reflects the current needs of the child. And on the children's waiver transmittal form, there is a part on that form for the care manager to attest that the statement remains true and valid. And all communication and sharing of records is through the HCS secure file transfer. Okay, so the next flow, this is table 2 in the manual. And if you look in the manual, it's on pages 3 and 4. These are for level of care eligibility redeterminations for children in foster care with a developmental disability. This includes children who have transitioned from the Office of Children and Family Services Bridges to Health DD waiver. So I just want to mention, children in foster care must have a DD diagnosis in order to be eligible for the children's waiver. So this hinges on their eligibility for the services. So the first box talks about the health home care manager and CS, and they need to work with the voluntary foster care agency or LDSS to gather the required documentation, which we just went over on the previous slide, and submit that documentation to the children's liaison. And that will be through the HCS secure email box. If the child is in New York City, ACS should be copied on this transmittal, and there's an email address in the manual to do so. The next step, the OPWDD DDRO Children's Liaison reviews the documentation and advises the care manager or CES if additional information is needed. The DDRO Children's Liaison then enters the UAS or the CANS and completes the HCBS level of care. Now we go into more detail on the next slide as to how the Children's Liaison does this. The next step, it's actually in conjunction, both the Children's Liaison and the Health Home Care Manager work together. If the child is found HCBS eligible and ICF-I eligible for the children's waiver, the Children's Liaison sends the LCED to the care manager with copies to ACS if the child lives in New York City and the voluntary foster care agency. If the child is not found ICF-I LCED eligible, the Children's Liaison sends the notification to the Health Home Care Manager and CS with copies to ACS if the child is in New York City and the voluntary foster care agency. Now, this is important to note. If they are not found ICF-I eligible, they are no longer eligible for children's waiver services. So the last step shows that the Health Home Care Manager or CS sends an NOD to the child and authorized parties, which documents this result. All right, now what I just mentioned in the previous slide, this is what the DDRO Children's Liaison has to do in order to perform the redetermination for DD foster care children. In the UAS, they go into the target population, choose if the child or youth meets DD foster care target population. Risk factors, choose one of the following. 1, the child is currently in foster care, or 2, the child was originally in foster care when they received HCBS waiver services. Now, it's important to note if the child is no longer in foster care, but they were originally, they can still receive children's HCBS waiver services. And then the last step, the functional criteria. The Children's Liaison will choose whether the child or youth meets the ICF-I LCED, and if yes, the child youth has met HCBS level of care for the children's waiver.
Now, just remember, as a care manager in CS, you'll be able to see that this eligibility has been done. So you won't need anything else from the DDRO. You'll have that letter that says they're eligible or they're not, and then you'll know whether or not they're eligible or not for the children's waiver, like officially, through the UAS, which you would have access to because the child or youth is your member and on your members list.
And I also just wanted to mention, kind of just going back to if the child does not meet level of care eligibility, the Health Home Care Manager sends the NOD and they will notify capacity management and if discharged. So there's more detail, again, in the DDRO manual on page 4 regarding that. Now we get into the process for children's waiver and newly enrolling children, or net new to the state service system. The first table, well, actually it's not the table, we have a slide here, and we just wanted to have a little mention that this process is not a linear process. So there's multiple paths to services and different roles for each entity based on the situation and the target population. Children new to services can access services through multiple doors. And our goal is that all doors are the right door so that children and families receive the services that they need in an expeditious manner and they're not left wondering, where do I go for access and support.
And you'll notice if you're looking at the manual, we've drafted many of the flows as if the first contact were the DDRO. That may not be, and obviously if they're coming directly to the health home, you're going to skip some of those first steps. So just keep that in mind as you're working through the manual.
Right. So the first new table, and it's on pages 5 and 6 of the DDRO manual, is a child comes to OPWDD. They're potentially medically fragile with a suspected developmental disability. So these are new children, and this process includes children who have Medicaid already established, and as I said, are potentially medically fragile and are suspected to have a developmental disability. Now this first orange box, it says OPWDD front door conducts a triage and refers to the children's liaison if the child appears to have a developmental disability and may also be medically fragile. Now this can be a referral from a hospital if a baby is coming out of a NICU and they know that OPWDD can assist with helping the family obtain services. This bubble right here kind of displays that type of scenario. The second box, the children's liaison offers the child and family options for the 2 different waivers that are available, the children's waiver or the OPWDD comprehensive waiver. And again, these orange boxes, it's kind of inside baseball, I should say, for OPWDD. So there could be a little back and forth here within our state agency. The children's liaison will refer to OPWDD's front door to move forward with the process for the comprehensive waiver, or they will look up a list of health home care managers that's also listed in your DDRO manual and find one, reach out to them, or say yes if the family does not want comprehensive care management for access to the children's waiver to begin that process. So now the blue boxes, if the choice of the family is to enroll in the children's waiver, the health home care manager or CS will conduct the HCBS level of care medically fragile target population in the UAS. If the child is found to be HCBS level of care eligible, then the health home care manager CS will work with the child and family on their plan of care. If the child is interested in obtaining ICF-I eligibility, remember, this is not required to enroll in the children's waiver, but if they do want to pursue ICF-I eligibility through OPWDD, the health home care manager or CS will submit the children's waiver transmittal form with the required documentation. And we went over that previously. It's in the DDRO manual. It lists out the initial requirements for ICF-I eligibility, and also the health home care manager must fill out the children's waiver transmittal form. If the child is not found to be HCBS level of care medically fragile eligible, but is suspected to have a DD diagnosis, the health home care manager or CS will email the transmittal form to the children's liaison for referral to the OPWDD comprehensive waiver. Now, I may be repeating myself, but the child only needs to meet the medically fragile target population to access children's waiver services. If they do not, they can be referred to OPWDD for referral to the OPWDD comprehensive waiver. And as we mentioned before, the best practice would be to obtain and then maintain ICF-I eligibility for a child with a developmental disability.
Yeah, I think it's really important for people to understand that to meet the target population for DD Med-Frag, you need both, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we're saying that if you don't meet the Med-Frag, then you won't meet the Med-Frag DD for the children's waiver. And if the child obviously has a suspected developmental disability or a condition or a diagnosis, then their best route would be to come to OPWDD. So you already know that of the 2 items that need to be accomplished, one it does not meet, so you already know they won't be eligible for the children's waiver.
All right, so the next slide displays, these are new children. The scenario is new children, potentially medically fragile with a developmental disability, again, both of them are possibilities, and the child does not have Medicaid. So it's very similar to the previous slide, except the child does not have Medicaid established yet. In the first box, OPWDD, the front door conducts a triage and refers to the children's liaison if the child appears to have a developmental disability and may also be medically fragile. The children's liaison offers the child family options for services, so a choice of 2 waivers to pursue, children's waiver or the OPWDD comprehensive waiver, and the family makes the choice of the waiver. With the family's verbal consent, the children's liaison refers to CES for HCBS level of care and Medicaid. So the child needs to establish Medicaid before going any further, and that is why we refer to CES. CES will conduct the HCBS level of care medically fragile target population in the CANs. If found eligible, CES will assist the child and family with their Medicaid packet. Now the second blue box. Once the child has Medicaid, the family chooses CES or the health home care manager for care management. And they work, whichever is chosen, they work with the child and family regarding their plan of care. If the family wants ICF-I eligibility determination as well, as I mentioned on the previous slide, the health home care manager or CES will submit the children's waiver transmittal form with all of the required documentation to the children's liaison. And again, this is through the secure email box, which again is listed at the end of the PowerPoint. If the child is not found to be HCBS level of care medically fragile eligible, but is suspected to have a developmental disability, then the health home care manager or CES will email the children's liaison through the secure email box for referral to the OPWDD comprehensive waiver. All right, so the last scenario, and this is the 5th table in the manual. It starts on pages 8 and 9. This scenario is a child in foster care with a potential developmental disability. So it's a new child. This process includes children who are in the foster care system and are suspected to have a developmental disability. We wanted to note that all children in foster care already have Medicaid established and are in or must be referred to a health home to receive services within the children's waiver. Now the first box, right here, the first step is with the care manager. So the health home care manager or CES, working with the voluntary foster care agency or the local Department of Social Services, will submit the children's waiver transmittal form to the children's liaison with the required documentations for ICF-I eligibility, which is noted on slide 19 and 20. Once that's submitted, the children's liaison reviews the documentation and requests additional information if needed. ICF-I eligibility determination is made if appropriate. Now I wanted to go back and just repeat myself again. A child must meet ICF-I eligibility if they are in foster care. The purple box in the middle, both the children's liaison and the health home care manager, if a child is determined ICF-I eligible, the children's liaison works with the health home care manager and CES to secure the physician's signature for the level of care eligibility determination. That is a requirement on the initial LCED. The OPWDD children's liaison will complete, now they go into the CANs. This is the 4th box. The children's liaison will go into the CANs to complete the DD foster care target population in the UAS, again completing the steps noted on slide 13, and they will send a letter and completed ICF-I LCED to the health home care manager or CES via the secure email box. Copies are sent to ACS if in New York City and the voluntary foster care agency. And again, this is a lot of information, but we tried to discreetly spell out each nuance in the DDRO manual. And then the last box, the health home care manager or CES will contact the Department of Health Capacity Management for a slot and inform via an appropriate NOD the family authorized rep of the decision. The health home care manager and CES will continue to work with the child and family on their plan of care. Okay, Now the next slide, we get into documentation requirements needed for the initial ICF-I level of care eligibility determination. This is spelled out on page 10 of the manual. And again, this is required for new foster care children, and as a best practice, we are urging people to complete the redetermination of the ICF-I level of care eligibility for children who have transitioned from the care at home waiver, or for children who are newly diagnosed with a DD diagnosis. I don't know. Do you want me to go over it, Paul? Or?
That's okay.
Okay, sure. So I'm just going to kind of go over what's needed here on the slide, and if others want to chime in, if I maybe missed something, feel free. So requirements: a general medical report for the child completed within the last 365 days, a copy of the child's plan of care, social developmental history, psychosocial report, or other report that provides information on the child's developmental history and or psychosocial status within the last 365 days. The third requirement, a current psychological report that includes an assessment of intellectual and adaptive functioning. Most recently, this could be the most recently available psychological report, may be used as long as it accurately reflects the child's current status. An early intervention multidisciplinary core evaluation may be acceptable, provided it includes standardized test scores relevant to cognitive, language, and communicative, adaptive, social, and motor functioning, and includes the participation of a school psychologist or a licensed psychologist. And for conditions other than intellectual disability, a medical or specialty report that includes the health status and diagnostic findings to support the developmental disability diagnosis. And this goes on. Additional information can be found at OPWDD's website right here. And we wanted to note additional documentation, if needed, may be requested by the OPWDD DDRO. Additional or more recent evaluation should always be requested by the DDRO if the information is not sufficient to establish eligibility.
I just wanted to jump in, and we'll ask Dr. Partridge, who's with us, to chime in if I say this wrong. But I think for folks who are maybe not accustomed to working in the OPWDD system, it's important to keep in mind that there's some differences between an initial ICF-LCED, so this is the first time a child in this case would be coming forward to obtain the ICF level of care eligibility, and continuing one. So once we've established that, as long as you keep it current, there's some streamlining. What we're reviewing in this slide is the initial ICF-LCED.
That's correct, Kate. There are certain things that we need to look at in terms of the initial LCED, and so the requirements for the initial LCED are a little bit more stringent in terms of the timeframes for the submission of the documentation, and including the medical report that needs to be within 365 days, and the plan of care or the social information also within the 365 days. The redeterminations, there is not that level of specificity. What we ask for is that the documentation submitted and is reviewed, it accurately reflects the current needs of the child. So if those were to change at any time, we would want updated information or other updated information as it becomes available. So if the child has an updated psychological evaluation, it would be great to submit that as part of a redetermination, but it's not necessarily required as long as the last psychological evaluation still accurately reflects the needs of the child. And this is why it's so important, once that initial LCED is established, to maintain it with through the annual redetermination process, because if the information, the redetermination is not done, then we have to go through the initial determination again. So we want to try and avoid that if we can.
Right. And so just to refer folks, in the manual, which is also available to you all, the draft manual, on page 10, we outline the differences between the redeterminations and the initial level of care. And then if you also review the children's waiver transmittal form, which Lisa referenced in several of the flows. You can also review that and see where the care manager attestation can be completed as part of that process. So just to give you a little bit of context in terms of the materials that you've already received.
All right, so this slide just displays OPWDD's Children's Liaisons contact list. And as we mentioned throughout the presentation, through documentation and the Children's Waiver Transmittal Form should be sent through the secure file transfer. The mailbox addresses are here based on the county that the child lives in. We have trained OPWDD Children's Liaison staff who have been trained in the CANs, and they're very well versed in the former OPWDD Care at Home program, so they will be able to pick up where the email leaves off with the documentation and go through the process. All right.
Great. So I hope that was helpful. And we just want to highlight again that all care managers and our partners need to have the HCS secure file transfer. So we've sent out a couple messages. We've had it on webinars. This is the process. All care managers need to have an HCS to access MAP as well as the UAS. So it's very simple. Once you have an HCS account, you're going in there to use MAP or the UAS. To be able to have this secure file transfer, you basically just have to download it, so to speak. And then you can, it's similar to Outlook or other email type databases where you have to look up or you can do a search function. So this is how you're going to talk to capacity management and the DDROs. Everything needs to go through this secure file transfer for confidential information regarding children. So there will be more guidance about that regarding capacity management at another time, but we want to highlight, again, we always want to highlight CS and how to contact them, and their referral form is online and their phone number. And then the next slide is just our regular contact for the health home. So again, if you're having concerns or problems with the process for HCBS eligibility regarding the DD and the DDROs, please contact us. We have a great working relationship with OPWDD, and we'll figure it out and get you on your way. I think it's really important for folks to understand, and we know we're in June, that the process before, right, was very isolated and very concrete for folks. You know, the OPWDD Care at Home program was here at OPWDD, and children in foster care were with specific agencies and with OCFS and ACS. So there was processes regarding that people knew. Now that we have a consolidated children's waiver and hundreds, and in some places really thousands of care managers, we had to try to come up with a process that was as easily understood as possible. And it did take us a little bit of time to make sure, and I appreciate OPWDD getting the manual and working hard. And they wanted to streamline some processes, and they did that, even though you may not understand or know that. They really did streamline some processes, especially around the redetermination and things like that. So we hope this step-by-step process is helpful. And I would just recommend that you print out or download or whatever the slides and this manual. It's very easy read. It's not like a volume and a half or anything. They're charts, and I think it's very user-friendly and understandable. And then, of course, we have some more helpful resources there, et cetera. So that ends our presentation, and our MCTAC friends will be sending us questions that people have. Caitlin, I don't know if you have something to say.
Yes, just a reminder to please send in your questions. Please chat them into the host. and we'll give the stage just a few minutes to look through what's come in already, and then we'll be able to start answering.
So the first question I have is the HCBS LOC determination within the UAS the CANS or something else? So it is not the CANS, all right? It's in the UAS along with the CANS. So if you have a member who has a CANS and also needs an HCBS eligibility determination, you would be able to see all their previous CANS that were completed, but is actually a separate tool within the UAS. And for SED and for MedFrag, when you get to the functional criteria, remember there's 3 pieces you have to do: the target population, the risk factors, and when you get to the functional criteria, then that is a subset of questions from the CANS. And there's an algorithm that goes with those 2. And the SED subset and the MedFrag subset of the CANS questions are different, clearly, because it's a different population. So I know we use those words interchangeable, UAS, CANS. So really, the tool of the CANS and the HCBS eligibility are in the UAS, but they're there together, and they can be linked to one another and things like that. So I'm going to just read this question, and we also have Mimi Weber on the phone from OCFS, so folks can feel free. For the foster care population who are new and have DD, you say they must be referred to the health home care manager for determination of HCBS. What if the child does not meet health home eligibility because their only condition is DD? So I'm going to just answer the first part. Remember that HCBS equals health home, and so the only people that have access to go into the UAS and to do anything regarding eligibility is the care managers, CES, and OPWDD, your children's liaison. So as you just saw through this webinar, all the paperwork and information that the OPWDD Children's Liaison needs is coming from the Health Home Care Manager, or CES. So they would have to be connected to a health home. Many of your voluntary foster care agencies are also health home or have health home care management as a service. I don't know if anybody else wants to say anything else. That's it. And you can get into health home without proving health home eligibility. So once you're HCBS eligible, you're also health home eligible, and you don't need to prove health home eligibility separate and apart unless they, for some reason, are no longer eligible for the children's waiver. If you want them to stay in health home, then you would have to prove health home eligibility. Will the court evaluation for EI, I'm assuming that's early intervention, right, be accepted if it does not include a psychological?
A psychologist, right.
Oh, I'm sorry. A psychologist, how about if I read the question correctly? In our county, only OT, PT, speech language, SI, are included in the core eval. Children in early intervention typically do not get an eval by a psychologist until they go through CPSE.
So we would need to have the psychological evaluation completed by a psychologist. If it's not done as part of an EI, there would need to be a separate evaluation. There may be some local resources that might be able to help out in terms of, some of the resources available at Article 16 clinics or something like that. I believe that OPWDD has some resources identified on the OPWDD webpage.
So if there's questions about needing the documentation related to an initial LCED for a child, you can also contact the DDRO for assistance with that?
Yep, exactly.
And your children's liaison can always be a resource to you, kind of a one-stop shop for children in the children's waiver, and they can help connect you to the people who can answer those specific questions. There's also additional resources on the OPWD website related to this that you can also review, and the links are in the material.
Okay, there's another question. Will there be timelines on turnaround for these determinations? I don't think we have a set hard and fast deadline time frame, but material and documentation needs to be collected in advance of the child's LCED redetermination date. And I think as a best practice, didn't we go over even 3 to 4 months ahead of time obtaining information?
3 to 4 months, taking a look at what information is available and if anything needs to be updated prior to the redetermination. You know, eligibility goes a lot faster when all of the required documentation is submitted all at once. What really slows down eligibility is if there is additional information that's needed or wasn't submitted as part of the initial referral, and then there's a certain amount of kind of going back and forth. So we're hoping that by identifying all of the information that we need up front, this will help speed the process for everyone.
And I would just encourage folks, since it's a new process and people are still learning, that if people feel like there's delays or whatever, to reach out to us or OPWDD. And, you know, we need to, you know, track how this is going and see if there's any issues so that we can address that. But it's difficult when people are learning, it's all new, and as just mentioned, if pieces of paper are going back and forth because you don't have a complete packet, that will obviously delay the process.
And I just want to make another note. This is Kate Marley from OPWGD. For the redeterminations, so for the child that is already known to have a developmental disability and meet ICF level of care, the LCED, that's established. The redetermination really can be facilitated, and a well-written plan of care that clearly documents the child's social and psychological status, and the confirmation from the care manager on the transmittal form will greatly speed the review process for those redeterminations. So just, you know, I think a point to note that it really isn't, that is in the hands of the care manager, and some attention in the care plan will really facilitate particularly the redeterminations.
Can we put it on mute for 1 second? All right, we're just going to put it on mute just for a moment to sift through a few more questions. We did want to address, there is some concern, especially down in New York City and in the western part of the state, for foster care children with a developmental disability that have a redetermination due, and that has not been achieved or met within the 365-day time frame. So there's been a lapse there. It is the responsibility of the health home care manager to forward the necessary medical and other documentation, clinical documentation, to the children's liaison to process and move forward with these redeterminations. Now, we understand there has been a lapse in a lot of these, and we're looking at it internally to see if there's some flexibility on our end, given that the transition just took place and we're trying to work out all the kinks, so we don't have to start from scratch for these kids and their eligibility determination for ICF-I ID.
So there'll be more information forthcoming on that. We're just reviewing that now.
I think if you have had one that lapsed and you want to reach out to us, that would be important to note. So, it's a requirement of the waiver, the previous 6 waivers as well as the children's waiver, that there's an annual determination. Otherwise, technically, the child isn't in the waiver. So we know this has happened in other, like the other care at home programs. So, we'll give some flexibility during this transition, but it is then after that a yearly determination. There's a question of what are we doing with children that are DD but no longer in foster care, like they've been adopted? So I just want to remind folks that if the child's in foster care and receives the waiver, and then they leave foster care, whether they go home or get adopted, they can continue with the waiver, and they can continue to have the waiver services as long as they continue to meet eligibility, unless there's a break in service. So that was part of the Bridges to Health program, and we, assume that same rule. So say a child's in waiver and they're in foster care and then they get adopted, they continue their waiver services, they continue to be eligible. Then after a year, the adopted family says, we do not want the waiver service, and they end the waiver service. Then later, months later, they decide that, or they think that the child needs waiver services. Now that child would have an option to either go to OPWDD and see if they might be eligible for OPWDD's comprehensive waiver, or they could go to the children's waiver if the child may meet potentially the SED target population or the med-frag population, so, or the DD med-frag population, right? So they can go through one of those other target populations. So they still have options, but we want to make sure that people understand if you continue your waiver as you leave foster care, you can continue to have those services. Of course, as long as you meet eligibility.
Yeah.
So can we designate pertinent staff member to also receive the notification from a secure file? This is to safeguard notifications being overlooked by care managers. So I think you totally can do that, right? So so there's a couple things that would have to happen, like the children's transmittal form, you would have to put the right person on the form that you would want the DDRO to be communicating with. And the same thing with capacity management. You can also put multiple people on an email, a secure file email. So if you want a constant person along with the care manager, you could do something like that. So you just need to make sure that's communicated, because usually what happens is the person who sends the secure file email is who it gets returned to. So that is the challenge. So if you have a care manager send something, there's no guarantee that it would go to other people unless those other people were on the secure file or it was directly from that person. So we just want to make sure that folks are clear, and whoever you designate then needs to make sure they're responsive in the fact that, like, if the DDRO needs more information, they're going to be sending information, or if capacity management sends something, then you would have that. So there's the ability to do that. It's just based on how you send the specific email the first time around. So I'm going to read this email. Under the B2H waiver, children determined to be fully eligible were allowed to have the ICF form completed by an in-house QMRP. Will that continue under the children's waiver? I don't know what a QMRP is.
I think that refers to the ICF-I eligibility determination, and can it be completed by a QIDP at OPWDD?
No, it sounds like they want at the agency.
Oh, in-house.
Like their house.
No, that would be a no. No, all of the ICF-I eligibility determination has to be completed by OPWDD. That's why all the documentation is sent to the children's liaison via the secure email box.
So that specific process for foster care has been changed because, again, we have health homes.
Consistency of practice.
Right, and we have health homes and consistent processes.
So just to give some background to that, in the Care at Home program, it was always OPWDD's role for the OPWD Care at Home waiver. That was the role of the now children's liaison. It was different in B2H, but we have to be consistent in practice. And what we've made sure is that our children's liaisons in our DDROs qualify as QIDPs, which are qualified intellectual and disability professionals, and so they can provide that function.
Which is one of the streamlined processes you all came up with for those redeterminations.
Yep. So it is a change for folks who worked in B2H, but would be much more, consistent with folks who had worked as a care manager in the OPWD Care at Home program.
Okay. So this webinar is not about this question, but I feel like I have to answer it because I keep getting it and we'll have to post something. So for MedFrag eligibility, when you complete the 3 forms by the teacher, the parent, the MD, where do those forms go? Those forms stay with you, those care managers. So that stays with you, and you complete, you have somebody complete the LPHA form, and you will need those 3 forms attached to the LPHA form. Please do not send them to DOH. So we are actually reposting the 3 forms today with the removal of the DOH email and address, because DOH is getting separate forms from parents and teachers. There's no way to put a packet together if it doesn't come in a packet. So we're going to have more guidance around that, and also Medicaid eligibility, because we are getting a lot of questions, but I just felt like I had to answer that because it was asked. So I hope that's helpful. The required documentations for MedFrag, I'm going to refer you to our website and to MCTAC's website to look at what that process is. So there's a question about the freedom of choice selection. So this is really important to mention, and I think Kate did that already, but we were trying to outline today how the health home care managers, CES, collaborate and communicate and work with the DDROs to get the ICF-I LCED, look at me, determination done here at OPWDD. So all those other processes from those other webinars are still intact, okay? So we're not changing that. So once someone is determined eligible for the children's waiver, whether they have ICF level of care or not, right, depending on the workflow, once they're eligible for the children's waiver, then the care manager or CES sits down with the family and reviews the freedom of choice selection, because that's when you're going to be like, do you still want waiver services? Here are your needs. You get to pick your providers. You get to pick your services. That's what that form does. So it's after eligibility is done, and that would be done by the care manager and by CES. So there's also, regarding that same question, about the medical consenter. So I know in the foster care world, there's a medical consenter. So to me, it's the health home care manager or CES would sit down with the parent, the guardian, the legally authorized representative, and the child, if they're age appropriate or they're over the age to self-consent, to get all the forms signed for consent, If the medical consenter has the ability to do some of that, then that would be okay. But in the health home world, it's the parent, guardian, legally authorized representative, or the individual if they are at a self-consenting age, or pregnant, married, or parent. So at any point, will the DDRO be completing the CAN subset in the UAS for MedFrag? No. They won't be doing that because, again, if the child's going to go through the MedFrag door, then the health home care manager or CS will be doing that to expedite the process. Because if they're going to meet MedFrag, then they're going to meet the children's waiver. If they're not going to meet MedFrag, then they're not going to meet the children's waiver because you need DD MedFrag, right? It's both. We are just trying to show you how a child with DD needs to be connected to OPWDD appropriately to get potentially other services. And then for DD foster care, there is no MedFrag questions, and that is the only time they will be in the UAS completing the HCBS eligibility determination.
There's a question, has the transmittal form been updated and different from the one being used previously? This is a brand new form. I'm not sure if with front door and eligibility, if there was a separate transmittal form.
Yeah, they're probably referring to the eligibility transmittal form, but this is a totally
This
different.
is a children's waiver transmittal form.
It's an interagency communication tool.
And it says at the top on page 12, children's waiver transmittal form. So yeah, different transmittal form, strictly for the children's waiver. And again, use it for the next month. We'll look at it. If we can make it better, we will, but we want to make sure we get all the contacts, care manager, you know, if there's other, for example, folks in the foster care system that need to be connected, that information is all here. It also provides a place for the care manager to attest to the child's continuing eligibility and status for redetermination. So we really tried to pull it all together in a single form to support the speed and accuracy of communications related to the children's waiver.
It hasn't been circulated yet.
You're seeing it for the first time. So as part of this manual and as part of this training, you are literally at the ground floor of the new form. So we're very excited.
So somebody emailed and said we weren't clear on a question, so I apologize. So for DD foster care, if the only condition the child has is DD, the question was, do they need to meet health home eligibility? And the answer is no if they are being referred to the health home care manager or CES for HCBS. And so I would encourage you to talk to your health home. There is a process that you would determine the child is HCBS eligible prior to enrolling the child. So the child's not technically enrolled until they meet health home eligibility or HCBS eligible, but a health home care manager can work with a family without enrolling them, right? It's called outreach. There's a process that to do that and map and things like that. So people can be referred to the health home for health home only. They can be referred to the health home for HCBS only, or they could say, I don't know, the kid needs help, or the family needs help, health home, HCBS, and the care manager's responsibility is to go figure that out, right? They'll meet with the family and determine whether or not they can make them eligible for health home, and maybe they could enroll them right away while they get to learn more about them and then determine HCBS. But if they think a child really needs HCBS to prevent them from going to a higher level of care, or maybe they're in a hospital or a residential setting and we want to get them back home, then they can work with that child to determine HCBS eligibility. So I hope I did better answering that question for you. And you can always reach out to us if I didn't do good, and I'll get someone else to answer.
There's a question, will the OPWDD DDRO send a level of care to the health home care manager after determining the eligibility? Yes. The DDRO Children's Liaison will send the ICF-I level of care eligibility determination to the health home care manager or CS after there's a determination of that LCED eligibility.
And if you look at the manual, you'll see that that's like sort of one of the final steps in each of those flows, the signature, the finalization of the LCED form, and then the return of that to the pertinent parties, especially, of course, the care manager.
And depending on the population, such as for foster care, a copy will go to ACS in New York City and the Voluntary Foster Care Agency.
So do you see the question about?
So there's a question related to provisional eligibility for children for OPWDD. So just broadly, and then we're going to hand it over to our expert. Provisional eligibility when a child is young, typically you will not have a permanent diagnosis of a developmental disability because the child is still developing. So a very young child will have a provisional eligibility, but that needs to be confirmed once they reach the age of 8. So once they reach 8, if a child has provisional eligibility, it's time to make that eligibility permanent. And so there is a separate process for that, and it's basically the initial process. But do you want to explain that?
Sure. So for people who are receiving services under provisional eligibility, we do request updated information, usually around, between the ages of 7 and 8. And that would be an updated psychological evaluation, information related to their diagnosis. Some of this will be being submitted as part of the redeterminations. So if as part of the annual LCED redetermination, there's an updated psychological evaluation at age 6, please send that in. And we may be able to do some of the provisional eligibility stuff based on that documentation when it comes due. But understanding whether the person, whether the individual has provisional eligibility or not is very important. And at that key transition stage from around age 8, we will need likely some additional information related to diagnosis, level of functioning, in order to make that transition from provisional to permanent OPWDD eligibility.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's important to note, because we have care managers who have worked a long time in the OPWDD system and sort of well understand this process, and we may have other health home care managers who are newer to it and so might not be as fluent. If folks feel like they need more resources or training related to this eligibility process, please let us know. There are materials available, and we can certainly do, more in-service trainings on that particular topic if that's something that health homes in particular feel would be necessary.
Yeah, I would suggest that as care managers or care management agencies that you let your health home, your lead health home know if you feel like you need more assistance, and then we will talk with the health homes to gather, like, how many people are we talking about, and is it a widespread issue or whatever, so that we can work with OPWDD instead of getting one-off emails, because I don't know if that would be helpful. But please work with your lead health home, I think would be the best way to do that. So there is a question. Mimi, are you still on? I'm sorry. These are the rest of the questions, and we have a little time. It's the WMS question.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I'm here. I lost connection for a little while, but I'm back.
Oh, okay. Can I read this question to you because I'm not really sure what they're asking?
Sure.
For children in foster care who is responsible for transferring exemption to downstate Medicaid WMS? And it says question mark. I don't know what that means.
Finish the question?
That's the question. Are they talking about Medicaid coding or something else?
CRE coding would identify a child in the waiver, and the question is?
They're asking for children who are in foster care, who's responsible for transferring those exemption, downstate WMS codes?
Right, because in today's environment, or in yesterday's environment, under the old waivers, in order to be eligible, there needed to be an R&E code on eMedNI/WMS. So the question that folks are the confusion is that, where does that eligibility on the system lie? And general confusion that we're no longer doing that on eMedNI/WMS, that it's all on the UAS.
Okay. Thank you. That's helpful. So for folks, I hope you know from previous webinars, for the new children's waiver, we have what we call K codes and for eligibility. And after a child receives a slot from capacity management, then the K codes will be put on the eMedNI ePACES file for that child, and it will determine there's K1, meaning you meet level of care, and then there's a number of other K codes, K3, 4, and 5, I believe, and maybe 6, designates whether the child meets SED, MedFrag, DD MedFrag, or DD foster care. So remember, every child who is determined eligible for the waiver has to come through capacity management and get a slot. And once that slot is designated, then the K codes are put up by actually DOH. So we have a process internally because, again, we consolidated these 6 waivers, and each waiver had their own process for putting up RE codes. So now, since we have to go through capacity management, then those K codes for the children's waiver are put up by DOH once a slot is given. Thank you for your help, Mimi, because I didn't understand the question. So I hope that answered that person's question. And then it looks like we have a couple questions from the DDROs, and I would just say that my understanding is there's going to be a follow-up to the DDROs from this specific webinar. So, so that what you want to say that?
No, you can actually, if you're a DDRO, children liaison, and anyone from the DDROs, and you have questions that you need answered, just send them to me, Deborah Wanger, and we are scheduling internal training in the very near future.
So we have a typo that, or an email that we have a typo in the manual on regarding the ACS email. Where I'm looking, we have it correct. So we can update that, but why don't, if you have a pen and the manual in front of you, the correct ACS mailbox is OCFH.
No, she's telling you, oh.
Yeah.
No. Okay, go ahead.
.waiver@acs.nyc.gov. And I hope it's there, but I guess somewhere in there we have a typo.
Hey,
so
Bianca, can you...
Remember, that's draft.
Bianca, can you email us back and tell us what page you're looking at or what you're looking at, because it might be in multiple places, and we'll make sure it's fixed. Thanks. So we're almost out of time, but I don't see any other questions. Caitlin, do you see any other questions?
No, there aren't any other questions right now.
There is, I'm sorry, I did skip this question can you go back one slide?
Sure.
Anybody who's having trouble finding certain things, the HCBS assessment, the target population, anything like that, there's the UAS support desk right there, and they will either walk you through it or they'll direct you to the reference guide to help you. So that would be my suggestion, because I probably would tell you the wrong place if it's not in front of me. So their UAS support desk right there. Those folks will help you. And then obviously you can always go into the UAS, right, and go back into training, or there's also a reference guide, support, whatever. There's tip sheets and things like one-pagers. So if it's after hours or something like that, you could always try to reference that. And then I think we're all good here, Caitlin.
Yeah, I don't see any other questions, so we'd just like to thank everyone for joining, thank the presenters, and wish everyone a great rest of their day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.